His secret son needed my kidney to survive, and it shattered my world. The soft clinking of champagne glasses. That was the soundtrack to our 15-year lie. We were sitting in our favorite restaurant, the one with the white tablecloths and candles that made everyone look 10 years younger and 1,000 times happier than they probably were. Our friends, David and Sarah, raised their glasses, their faces glowing. "To Mark and Alara," David said, his voice warm with genuine admiration. 15 years. You two are rock solid. Seriously, you're the couple we all look up to. I smiled, the kind of smile I had perfected over the years. It was bright and warm, and it reached my eyes just enough to be convincing. I squeezed Mark's hand under the table. His hand was there, but it felt distracted, static. Mark stood up, clearing his throat. He was so handsome, his salt and pepper hair catching the candlelight just right. He looked at me, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. "To my Alara," he began, and the words flowed out, smooth and practiced. "The architect of my happiness, the foundation of my life. These 15 years have been the best of my life, and it's all because of you." It was a beautiful speech. The kind of speech that makes other women at the table sigh and look at their own husbands with a hint of disappointment. But as he spoke, I saw it. A subtle, almost imperceptible flick of his eyes down to his phone, which was resting face down on the table. A moment later, I saw the screen light up from underneath. He shifted his wine glass slightly, just enough to cover the glow. He didn't miss a beat in his speech, but I saw it. My heart did a familiar, tired little flip-flop. It's just work, I told myself, pushing the thought away like an unwanted plate of food. He's a partner at the firm. It never stops. Don't ruin this. Not tonight. And so I smiled, and I raised my glass, and I kissed him when he sat down, playing my part as the adored wife. Because keeping the peace, that had become my primary job in our marriage. Later that night, back in our quiet, perfectly decorated house, the anniversary magic was supposed to continue. I'd changed into something more comfortable, ready to just curl up with him, to feel the comfort of another milestone safely passed. But as I came out of the bedroom, I saw him standing in the hallway, his back to me, phone pressed to his ear. His posture was rigid, his voice a low, tense whisper. "Look, I can't talk about this now," he hissed into the phone. "Just handle it. Did you get the results?" I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. My breath caught in my throat. He listened for a long moment, his shoulders slumping. Okay, damn it. I'll figure something out. I always do." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was deeply stressed. "No, she's here. She doesn't know anything, and we need to keep it that way." A familiar cold dread washed over me. It was the same feeling I got when he'd disappear for hours on his work trips, or when I saw charges on the credit card statement from towns he never mentioned visiting. It was the feeling of a door in my own house that was locked, and I was choosing not to even try the handle. He hung up and turned, finally seeing me. He flinched, his eyes wide with a flicker of something. Fear? Guilt? It was gone in a second, replaced by a weary smile. "Sorry, honey. Work emergency. A big client is having a meltdown. You know how it is." I just stood there, my heart thumping a dull, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I could have asked. I could have said, "Who is she? What results? What don't I know?" The questions were right there, burning on my tongue. But I looked at his tired face, at our beautiful home, at the life we had built on 15 years of carefully stacked moments just like this one. And I swallowed them. I chose the lie. "Of course," I said, my voice softer than I felt. "Let me get you a glass of water. Don't work too late." He smiled, relieved, and disappeared into his office, closing the door firmly behind him. I went to the kitchen and stood in the dark, my hands gripping the cold marble countertop. I had done it again. I had chosen the comfortable quiet over the messy, terrifying truth. For 15 years, choosing the quiet had always worked. But I had no idea that a frantic phone call the very next morning would shatter that quiet forever. The morning after our anniversary was quiet. Sunlight streamed into the kitchen, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I was trying to reset, to erase the memory of Mark's hushed phone call and the cold feeling it left in my stomach. I told myself it was just work. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma a small, comforting anchor in a sea of unspoken anxieties. Mark was still in the shower. The house was peaceful, and then the phone rang. It was the landline, which was unusual. I picked it up expecting a telemarketer. "Hello." A woman's voice, professional and brisk, came through the line. "Hello, I'm calling from University Hospital. I need to speak with Mark Collins, please." "It's urgent." My heart gave a little squeeze. "He's unavailable at the moment. Can I take a message?" "This is his wife, Alara." There was a brief pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "Yes, Mrs. Collins, this is Nurse Evans from the Pediatric Nephrology Unit. We really need to speak with your husband regarding his son. Leo." The world just stopped. The coffee cup in my hand felt impossibly heavy. The sunlight seemed to dim. I must have heard her wrong. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice sounding thin and distant. "His son? We don't have a son named Leo. We don't have any sons." Another pause, this one longer, filled with a confusion that mirrored my own. "Oh," the nurse said, her professionalism wavering for a fraction of a second. "The chart here lists Mark Collins as the father. Leo Collins." My mind was a whirlwind of noise. Leo, a name I had never heard. Pediatric nephrology, a kidney specialist for children. It made no sense. It was a mistake, a clerical error. It had to be. "There must be a mistake," I said, my grip tightening on the phone. Just then, Mark walked into the kitchen, a towel around his waist, his hair still damp. He was smiling, but it vanished the second he saw my face. He saw the color drain from it, the panic in my eyes. He didn't even have to ask what was wrong. He saw the phone in my hand and his face went completely, unnaturally pale. "Who is Leo?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. He lunged for the phone, snatching it from my hand with a roughness that shocked me. "This is Mark Collins." He barked into the receiver, turning his back to me as if to shield the conversation from view. I could only hear his side of it, clipped and frantic. "Yes, I understand. How is he?" "No, I'll be there as soon as I can." "Don't call this number again." He slammed the phone down. The plastic clattered loudly in the sudden, deafening silence. He stood there for a long moment, his back still to me, his shoulders rigid. He wouldn't look at me. When he finally turned, he looked like a stranger. His eyes were wide and he couldn't seem to meet my gaze. He was visibly scrambling, his mind racing to build a wall to put around this terrible, impossible truth. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "What is going on?" He cleared his throat, wiping a hand over his face. It's my old college friend Steve," he stammered, the words coming out too fast, too jumbled. "It's his son, Leo. He's sick. Really sick. And I'm his godfather. I'm listed as his emergency contact. That's all." I just stared at him. The lie was so thin, so fragile, I could see right through it. An emergency contact? Why wouldn't they call his parents first? A kidney specialist? Why did the nurse call him Leo Collins? Every word he said was a patch on a story that was already tearing at the seams. For 15 years, I had accepted his stories. I had papered over the cracks in our marriage with denial because I was terrified of the conflict, terrified of what I might find if I pushed too hard. But this was different. This wasn't a hushed phone call or a vague credit card charge. This was a child. A sick child. A son. For the first time, I couldn't bring myself to believe him. The emotional armor I had so carefully constructed around my heart for over a decade didn't just feel dented. It felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces. I had no idea that the next call from that hospital would be the one to grind those pieces into dust. The atmosphere in our house for the next 2 days was suffocating. Mark was trying too hard. He'd make cheerful small talk about the weather, about a project at work, about a movie he wanted to see. But his cheerfulness was a thin, brittle veneer over a pit of raw panic. He moved around the house like a ghost, avoiding my eyes, his shoulders perpetually tensed. And I let him. I played along, matching his hollow chatter with my own, because the alternative was to stop, to stand still in the silence and to ask the questions that I was terrified to have answered. My life had become a stage play, and we were both just desperately trying to remember our lines. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a doctor this time, not a nurse. Mark put the phone on speaker, a clumsy attempt at transparency that only made my stomach clench tighter. "Mr. Collins." The doctor's voice was grave, weary. "I'm calling to update you on Leo's condition. I'm afraid it's not good news. His kidney function has dropped another 10%. He's in complete renal failure. We're moving him to the top of the transplant list, but honestly, we're running out of time. We're testing all available family, but we are desperately searching for a donor. I listened, my hand flying to my mouth. A real child. A child who was dying. All the suspicion and anger I felt seemed to curdle into a thick, complicated guilt. This wasn't just about Mark's lies anymore. And in that moment, my fatal flaw, my desperate, lifelong need to smooth things over, to fix the cracks instead of admitting the foundation is broken, took over. I saw a path. A way to be the good wife, the supportive partner. A way to prove that I trusted him even when I didn't. A grand gesture to make this whole nightmare go away. Before I could stop myself, I leaned toward the phone. "Doctor," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "This is Alara, Mark's wife. I'd like to get tested." Silence. On the other end of the line, the doctor was clearly surprised. From beside me, Mark made a small, strangled noise. "Honey, no," he said, immediately reaching for the phone. His eyes were wide, panicked. "You don't have to do that. It's too much to ask." "I'm offering," I said, my gaze locked on his, challenging him. A part of me was screaming, "See? He doesn't want you to. It's because he's lying." But the other, more powerful part, the part that had run my life for 15 years, just wanted to make it all okay. "It's a long shot, Alara," Mark insisted, his voice strained. "The odds are astronomical. It's not your responsibility." But I had already made up my mind. I ignored the frantic, desperate look in his eyes and made the appointment. The next few days of waiting were the longest of my life. The silence in the house was no longer just tense. It was heavy with the ticking of a clock. The call came on Friday. It was the hospital again, but this time they asked for me. "Mrs. Collins?" It was the doctor. His voice was different. The weariness was gone, replaced by something I could only describe as, "We have your results." I've been doing this for 20 years, and I have to say, I've never seen anything like this outside of identical twins. I held my breath. Mark, who had been pretending to read the mail, froze by the counter, his knuckles white where he gripped an envelope. "You're a match, Mrs. Collins," the doctor said, his voice buzzing with disbelief. "Not just a match. You are a perfect 1 in 100,000 6-for-6 antigen match. It's a medical miracle, a miracle." The word echoed in the silent kitchen. But it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a verdict. The doctor wasn't finished. He let out a small, professional laugh. "Honestly, a match this perfect is almost exclusively found in a direct blood relative, like a parent or a sibling. It's just statistically impossible otherwise." He paused, and then he asked the question that brought my entire world crashing down. "Mrs. Collins, are you absolutely sure you aren't related to the boy?" I held the phone, the doctor's innocent question hanging in the air like a hangman's noose. I slowly turned my head and looked at my husband. At the man I had spent 15 years with. He was staring at me, his face ashen, his eyes filled with the terrifying final recognition of a man who has been caught. And in the crushing silence that followed, I knew that Mark was finally, completely out of lies. I hung up the phone, but my hand remained frozen, gripping the receiver. The doctor's words echoed in the sudden tomb-like silence of my kitchen. "Are you absolutely sure you aren't related to the boy?" I turned my head, a slow, creaking motion, and looked at my husband. The carefully constructed mask of the successful, charming Mark Collins had crumbled into dust. His face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked trapped, a cornered animal. The air grew thick, heavy. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to have died. "Mark?" I said. My own voice was a stranger's, a dry, cracking whisper. "Tell me the truth." That's when he broke. It wasn't a single clean snap. It was a slow, agonizing collapse. He staggered back, his hand flying up to brace himself against the granite countertop as if his legs could no longer hold his weight. He squeezed his eyes shut, his whole body shuddering. And then came the sound. A low, guttural sob that seemed ripped from the deepest part of him. He slid down the cabinets until he was sitting on the floor. His head in his hands, his shoulders shaking, my core flaw, my deep-seated aversion to conflict, was screaming at me to go to him, to comfort him, to make the terrible sounds stop. For 15 years, my instinct had been to soothe his troubles, to maintain the calm. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the wreckage he had just made of our life. "He's mine, isn't he?" I asked the top of his head. "Leo?" "He's your son." He nodded, a jerky, miserable motion, without looking up. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with manufactured tears. "It was before you, Alara, I swear. It was years before I even met you. He looked up at me then, his eyes red and pleading. He was already building the new lie, brick by painful brick. Her name was Nora. It was a mistake. A brief, stupid mistake in my 20s that I thought was long over. He painted a picture for me. A story of a youthful error, of a relationship that meant nothing, of a woman who disappeared from his life only to return years later with a secret. I only found out about Leo 6 years ago, he continued, his voice gaining a pathetic kind of strength. She found me. She told me I had a son. What was I supposed to do, Alara? I wanted to tell you, I swear I did. But how could I? How could I bring this ugliness into our life? Into the beautiful life we'd built? He was framing himself as the hero. The tragic, noble man, secretly carrying this immense burden all alone, all to protect me. It was a performance worthy of an award. And the most twisted part? A small, desperate piece of my heart, the piece that had run on autopilot for 15 years, wanted to believe him. It wanted to accept this version of the story because it was containable. It put the betrayal in the past.
It made it something we could theoretically overcome.
He saw the flicker of weakness in my eyes and seized it. He crawled across the floor on his knees, stopping at my feet. He looked up at me, his face a mask of anguish. I've been supporting him ever since, he choked out. Secretly. Just sending money. Trying to do my duty without shattering everything. Without shattering you? Can you forgive me, Alara? Please, I love you. You are my life. He then delivered the final, masterful stroke of manipulation. This is a nightmare, he whispered. But we can get through it, together. This is our chance. A child's life is at stake. If you donate, you'd be saving him. You'd be saving all of us. He laid it all at my feet. The responsibility for his sin, the life of his child, the fate of our marriage. He wasn't just asking for forgiveness. He was asking me to fix it. I looked down at the man I thought I knew, this stranger sobbing on my kitchen floor, and I felt nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness. My world wasn't just broken. It was a crater still smoking from the impact. And he was standing on the edge, telling me it was my job to rebuild. I didn't have the strength to fight, not yet. All I could do was stand there, numb, as I allowed the first of his many lies to settle over me like a shroud. But even then, a cold voice in the back of my mind knew that I couldn't just take his word for it. I had to see this for myself. I told Mark I was going to the hospital. He tried to stop me, of course. He used that soft, pleading voice he always used when he was trying to manage me. Alara, what's the point? It will only upset you. Let me handle this. But for the first time in 15 years, his soft voice didn't soothe me. It sounded like a cage door rattling shut. I needed this story he had spun, this tale of a past mistake and a secret, noble burden, to have a face. I had to know what was real. The pediatric nephrology ward was quiet in a way that's louder than any noise. It was the quiet of hushed voices, of squeaking rubber-soled shoes, of parents holding their breath. The air smelled of antiseptic and something else, a faint metallic scent of fear. I walked down the hallway, my own footsteps echoing too loudly, until I found the room. 2 words were printed on a small card next to the door. 2 words that didn't belong together. Leo Collins. My husband's name? His son's name. Seeing it in black and white made it devastatingly, undeniably real. I looked through the large glass window, and my breath just left me. There was a little boy in the bed, swallowed by the crisp white sheets. He was so small, so pale. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with a sheen of sweat. Wires and tubes snaked from his tiny arms, tethering him to a bank of machines that beeped and hummed in a steady, somber rhythm. This was Leo. This was the reason my world had tilted off its axis. He wasn't a concept. He wasn't a mistake from the past. He was a real, living, breathing child who was fighting for his life. A woman was sitting in a chair just outside the door, her head in her hands. Her shoulders were slumped with a weariness that seemed to go down to the bone. She wasn't the monster I had subconsciously pictured. There were no claws, no fangs. She was just a mother. A terrified mother. She looked up as I approached, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, but there was a strength in them, a dignity that surprised me. She was Mark's past. She was Nora. I stopped in front of her. My throat was dry. What was I supposed to say? Hello, I'm the wife my husband built his real life with. I'm Elara, I managed to say, the name feeling foreign in my own mouth. Her eyes widened slightly. A flicker of something, recognition, maybe fear, passed over her face before being replaced by that same bone-deep exhaustion. I know, she said softly. She stood up, her movement slow. Thank you for coming, and thank you for getting tested. That was incredibly generous. Her sincerity was disarming. I had come here expecting a confrontation, an enemy. I had prepared myself for anger, for accusations. But there was no animosity in her voice. There was only the raw, desperate plea of a parent watching their child fade away. And then she said the words that would haunt me for weeks. She offered a small, sad smile. Mark always said you were a kind person. And just like that, the floor fell out from under me. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the casual, familiar way she said them. Mark always said. It wasn't a past tense affair. It wasn't a mistake. They talked. They talked about me. I wasn't just the wife. I was a character in their story, a topic of conversation. The kindness he praised me for was likely the very quality that made me so easy to deceive for all these years. My anger, the sharp, clean anger I had been clinging to, suddenly felt inadequate. It was too simple a feeling for this moment. I looked from Nora's tired, pleading face to the small, fragile boy in the hospital bed. The villain I needed to hate wasn't here. There was only another victim and a child caught in the wreckage of a man's cowardice. The anger was still there, a hot coal in my chest. But now it was buried under the weight of a heavy, complicated grief. Grief for the marriage I thought I had. Grief for this woman whose life had been a secret. And a deep, aching grief for the innocent boy whose life now depended on the kindness of a stranger his father had betrayed. I left the hospital that day knowing that Mark's story was a lie. But I still had no idea just how deep that lie actually went. Mark's story of a past mistake. It settled over our house like a fine layer of dust. For a few days, I tried to live with it. I tried to breathe it in and accept it as my new reality. He was being so attentive, so apologetic, so careful. He was playing the part of the repentant husband perfectly. But his story didn't feel right. It was like a beautiful piece of furniture with one leg that was just a little too short. Everything looked fine from a distance, but the second you put any weight on it, the whole thing wobbled. The wobble was Nora's voice in the hospital. The casual way she'd said, "Mark always said you were a kind person." That sentence was the splinter in my mind that I couldn't get out. I knew with a certainty that terrified me that I couldn't just accept his version of the truth. My conflict-averse nature was at war with the part of me that was screaming that I was a fool. So I decided to do something quiet, something that didn't involve yelling or tears, a practical step. I waited until he was asleep, until the house was dark and still, the only sound the gentle hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. I crept into his office. The room smelled like him, like his cologne and old books. It felt like a transgression just being in there without him. My target was the gray metal file cabinet in the corner, the one he kept locked. He always said it was for sensitive work documents. The key he thought I didn't know was in the pen cup on his desk, disguised as a tacky souvenir keychain. My hands were shaking as I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a quiet, sickening click. I told myself I was just looking for our mortgage papers, our life insurance policies. Practical things I'd need to have copies of, if I decided to leave. It felt like a reasonable, responsible thing to do. It felt like a safe way to prepare for a conflict I was still too scared to start. I pulled open the top drawer. Everything was meticulously organized. Folders labeled taxes, insurance, house. I pulled out the house folder, but my eyes snagged on something else. A single, slim manila folder tucked in the very back, behind everything else. It was from a different bank. A smaller local credit union I'd never even heard of. My heart started to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs. This was it. This was the locked door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the folder. "Don't," the old me whispered. "Let it go. Keep the peace," but I couldn't. I pulled it out. My name wasn't on it. The account holders were listed in crisp black print. Mark T. Collins and Nora L. Jensen. My vision tunneled. The air in the room felt thin, unbreathable. I sank into his leather office chair, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. With trembling fingers, I pulled out the statements inside. They went back years, a decade. I flipped through the pages, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. It wasn't just child support payments, it was a life. A whole entire life documented in debits and credits. There was a monthly mortgage payment for a house on a street I'd never heard of, in a town 45 minutes away. There was a car payment every month for a blue SUV. I'd never seen Mark drive a blue SUV. There were grocery bills, utility bills, credit card payments. Then I saw the charge that finally, irrevocably shattered me from 2 years ago. A charge for over $3,000 at a resort in Orlando. The dates matched perfectly with a week-long financial conference he had supposedly attended. I remembered that week so clearly. I remembered feeling a little lonely, but proud of how hard he worked for us. I had packed his suitcase for that trip. The papers slipped from my fingers and scattered across the floor. A cold, horrifying clarity washed over me. This wasn't a past mistake he was dutifully paying for. This was a present-tense reality he was actively living. He didn't have a secret child. He had a secret family. He didn't have one life burdened by a past mistake. He had 2 lives running in parallel, and I was in just one of them. My marriage wasn't damaged. It was a fiction, a carefully maintained illusion. The past 15 years of my life, the foundation I had built everything on, wasn't real. I wasn't his partner. I was his alibi. The grief was so immense it felt like I was drowning. But as I sat there in the dark, in the ruins of my life, something else began to flicker to life deep inside me. Something cold and hard and sharp. The shaking in my hands stopped. My breathing, which had been shallow and panicked, grew slow and steady. My objective was no longer just to survive the truth. It was to arm myself with it. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The grief was still there, a heavy, suffocating blanket. But underneath it, a new feeling was solidifying. It felt like a core of ice forming in the center of my chest. The woman who had spent 15 years avoiding conflict, the woman who would rather swallow a bitter truth than cause a scene. She was gone. She had died in Mark's office, on a leather chair surrounded by the scattered pages of his lies. In her place was someone else. Someone colder. Someone who understood that peace was no longer an option. War was the only path forward. That morning, I made 2 phone calls. I told Mark I was going to see my sister, that I needed some space. He agreed immediately, his voice dripping with a practiced, concerned sympathy that now made my skin crawl. He probably thought I was going off to cry and be comforted. He probably thought I'd come back, sadder but softer, ready to accept his narrative. He had no idea I was driving downtown. My first meeting was with a divorce attorney. I'd found her online, scrolling through websites at 3 a.m. Her name was Catherine Shaw, and her reviews used words like shark and unflinching and brilliant. Her office was on the 30th floor of a glass tower, with a view of the entire city. She was a woman in a perfectly tailored gray suit with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. I didn't cry. I sat across the polished mahogany desk from her and laid out the bank statements I had photographed with my phone. I told her the entire story, from the anniversary dinner to the doctor's impossible phone call to the discovery of his second life. My voice was low and steady. I was a witness reporting a crime. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "He's not just a liar, Mrs. Collins," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "He's a meticulous architect of deceit. Men like this, they don't just give up. They fight dirty. Right now you have the element of surprise. It's the only real weapon you have. Do not confront him. Do not let him know that you know." Not yet, she laid out the strategy. I needed more than bank statements. I needed proof. Hard, undeniable, visual proof of his double life. "We need to build a case so airtight," she said, steepling her fingers, "that by the time we're done, he won't have a single lie left to hide behind." My second meeting was in a dimly lit coffee shop on the other side of town. The man I met wore a rumpled blazer and had tired, knowing eyes. He was a private investigator, a former cop Catherine had recommended. I slid a plain white envelope across the table. Inside was a cash retainer and the address of the house on the bank statement. "I need to know everything," I told him. "I need to see the life he's been living when he's not with me." He nodded, glancing at the address. "You'll have it," he said, and then he was gone. Driving home, I felt different. The grief hadn't vanished, but it had a new companion, purpose. I was no longer just a victim of his betrayal. I was the architect of his downfall. When I walked through the door, Mark was waiting in the living room, his face a perfect mask of concern. How are you feeling, honey? He asked, rushing to my side. I let him put his arms around me. I leaned into him, letting him feel the slight tremble I no longer had to fake. The old Alara would have pulled away. But the new Alara understood the art of the long game. I'm overwhelmed, I said, my voice quiet and broken. I've been thinking about what you said. About Leo. I pulled back and looked him in the eyes, forcing myself to hold his gaze. I'm seriously considering it. The surgery. But I need time, Mark. I need time to process all of this. Relief washed over his face, so potent it was almost sickening. He thought he had me. He thought my kindness, my conflict aversion would be his salvation. He thought I was processing my grief. He had no idea I was planning a war, and I would give him all the time he thought I needed, while my own private army gathered the weapons I would use to burn his two worlds to the ground. A week later, a thick, plain brown envelope arrived. It wasn't delivered by the mailman. It was left on my porch, propped against a potted fern, with no return address. My heart hammered against my ribs as I picked it up. It felt heavy. Not just in weight, but with the significance of what I knew was inside. I took it to the dining room table, the one we only used for holidays and important dinners. It felt appropriate. A place for ceremony. A place for a funeral. My hands were surprisingly steady as I tore open the seal. Inside was a black binder. On the cover, a single white label with a case number. Not a name. Just a number. I opened it, and there it was. His other life. A life in pictures. The first photo was on top. It was a family portrait, professionally taken in a park filled with autumn leaves. There was Mark smiling his easy, charming smile. His arm was wrapped around Nora. She was looking at him with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love. And standing in front of them, holding Mark's hand, was Leo. He was maybe 7 or 8 in the picture, with Mark's dark hair and a wide, gappy grin. They looked happy. They looked real. More real, somehow, than the framed photos of Mark and me that sat on our mantelpiece. I flipped the page. My breath hitched. It was a Christmas photo. The 3 of them were sitting in front of a fireplace, wearing matching, ridiculous pajamas. And Mark was wearing the sweater. The expensive cashmere forest green sweater I had saved up to buy him for our 10th anniversary. I remembered the day I gave it to him. I remembered how his eyes lit up, how he'd said it was the nicest thing he'd ever owned. He was wearing my love for him, in a picture with his other family. I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to grip the edge of the table. Every memory I had was being systematically corrupted, rewritten into something ugly and false. I kept turning the pages. Each one was a fresh stab wound. There were photos from birthday parties with Leo blowing out candles on a superhero cake, Mark's arm proudly on his shoulder. There were school events, beach trips, pumpkin patches,
A whole childhood I never knew existed.
Then came the printouts from Nora's social media. Her profile was public. Of course it was. Why would she hide? In her world, she had nothing to hide. Her bio read, "Mom to Leo, loving wife to the best man in the world." There were dozens of photos of Mark. Mark grilling in a backyard I'd never seen. Mark asleep on a couch I didn't own. Captions filled with loving declarations. One, under a picture of them on a boat, read, "Another amazing anniversary trip with my husband. So lucky to be on this journey with you." The date of the post was from a weekend he was supposedly at a mandatory legal retreat in another state. My lonely business trips were his family vacations. My quiet weekends alone were his holidays. The entire foundation of my life, the bedrock of my last 15 years, was a lie. I wasn't a wife, I was the other woman. The convenient, stable, respectable life that allowed him to have his real one somewhere else. I closed the binder. The silence in the house was immense. I looked around at the furniture we'd picked out together, the art we'd hung on the walls, the whole carefully curated museum of our marriage. It was all a stage, a set for a play. And I was the only actor who didn't know the script. The grief I felt was no longer a sharp pain. It was a cold, quiet void, and as I sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that was never mine, the ringing of my phone reminded me that a real life was hanging in the balance, and the walls were starting to close in. The days that followed were a siege. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a holding cell, and the phone was my warden. Every morning, like clockwork, it would ring. A clinical, detached voice from the hospital would give me the daily update on Leo's declining health. His creatinine levels are up again. We had to increase his dialysis sessions. He's not responding as we'd hoped. Each report was a turn of the screw, tightening the pressure in my chest until I could barely breathe. Then there were Nora's messages. She never called when she knew I'd be home. She'd wait until she thought I was out, leaving tearful, rambling voicemails that were almost impossible to listen to, and even harder to ignore. I would stand in the kitchen, my hand braced against the wall, as her ragged voice filled the silence. "Alara, it's Nora. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. But he's so weak. He asked for his dad today, and please, I'm begging you. He's just a little boy." Every message was a fresh wave of guilt washing over me. This innocent child was dying, and I held the key to his life in my body. The moral weight of it was crushing, and Mark was unraveling. The mask of the grieving, repentant husband was slipping, revealing the desperate, ugly face of a man who was losing control. The soft, pleading tone was gone, replaced by a sharp edge of frantic impatience. He'd paced the living room while I was trying to read, running his hands through his hair. He'd corner me in the kitchen, his eyes wild. He stopped being sorry and started being demanding. The breaking point came one evening. I was sitting on the couch, the black binder from the PI hidden in my closet upstairs, its presence a cold, heavy secret. Mark stood over me, blocking the light from the lamp. "We need to talk about this, Alara," he said, his voice tight. "Time is running out." "I told you, I need to process," I said, my own voice a dull monotone. He let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. "Process? What is there to process? A child is dying. My son is dying." He knelt in front of me, his hands gripping the couch cushions on either side of my legs, trapping me. His charm was gone. All that was left was raw, selfish desperation. "Listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "You are the only person on this planet who can save him. Can you even begin to imagine the guilt of letting a child die? A child you could have saved? It would destroy you, Alara. It would follow you for the rest of your life." I stared into his eyes. And I saw it. He wasn't thinking about Leo. He wasn't thinking about me. He was thinking about himself. About his two perfect worlds colliding and the one variable, my choice, that he couldn't control. He saw the flicker of something in my expression and pressed his advantage. "This is our chance to fix this," he said, his voice softening into a grotesque imitation of sincerity. "This is how we make it right. You do this, you save him. And we can move past this. We can heal. Our family can heal. Our family." The words were a bitter poison on his tongue. As he spoke, something inside me went perfectly, icily calm. The hurt was still there, the grief was still there, but they were now encased in a layer of diamond-hard resolve. He thought he was appealing to my kindness, to my guilt. He thought he was manipulating the woman who always backed down, the woman who would do anything to keep the peace. He didn't realize he was talking to a stranger. I kept my eyes locked on his. My right hand, which was resting beside me on the couch, slowly closed around my phone. With my thumb, I swiped the screen, opened the voice memo app, and pressed the small red button. I let him keep talking. I let him spin his web of emotional blackmail, his voice a desperate, wheedling drone. Every word he spoke, every pathetic, manipulative plea, was another nail in his coffin, another piece of evidence for my arsenal. He thought he was backing me into a corner, but all he was doing was handing me the one weapon I still needed to end this. The time for waiting was over. The time for quiet investigation, for pretending, for swallowing my rage, was done. I had all the ammunition I needed. Now it was time to burn his world to the ground. That evening, I prepared the dining room table. I didn't set out plates or wine glasses. I set out the evidence of his treason. I arranged the pages from the private investigator's binder like a coroner laying out the instruments of a post-mortem. The bank statements formed the foundation. The glossy 8x10 photos of his other life, his real life, were arranged in a brutal, chronological timeline. The Christmas photo with the sweater I bought him, I placed that one right in the center, a centerpiece for our funeral. I was sitting at the head of the table, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, when I heard his key in the lock. He walked in, shrugging off his coat, a weary but cheerful smile already forming on his lips. "Hey, honey, what a day. What's for?" His voice died in his throat. He stopped dead in the entryway, his eyes landing on the table, on the sprawling, undeniable proof of his 15-year lie. I watched the color physically drain from his face, leaving behind a sick, waxy pallor. His briefcase slipped from his numb fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. He stared, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting from photo to photo. He looked like a man watching a replay of a car crash he had caused, one that he had somehow convinced himself he'd survived, only to realize he was the primary casualty. "Hello, Mark," I said. My voice was calm. So calm it scared even me. "I think it's time we finally talked." He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just slowly, mechanically, walked to the table, his movements stiff, robotic. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the Christmas photo. "Don't," I said, my voice sharp and cold as ice. "Don't you dare touch that." He flinched back as if burned. "That sweater," I said, my voice a low-level monotone, "was for our 10th anniversary. I saved for 6 months to buy that for you. Did you think of me at all when you wore it to play Happy Families with her?" "Alara," he started, his voice a ragged whisper. "I can explain—" "No," I cut him off. "No more explaining. No more lies." I stood up and picked up a bank statement. "This mortgage. For the house in Northwood? You told me the down payment for our house took everything we had. But you were already paying for hers, weren't you?"
I let the paper drop.
I picked up another photo. "This was from your mandatory legal retreat in Miami, I believe." Nora called it your anniversary trip on her Facebook. "Who was lying, Mark? You or her?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I was a prosecutor delivering my closing argument to a jury of one. I dissected his life, lie by lie, purchase by purchase, trip by trip. With every piece of paper I touched, I could see him shrinking, crumbling under the weight of his own colossal deceit. By the end, he was leaning heavily on the back of a dining chair, his face gray, his eyes empty. He had nothing left. Then I sat back down. "I've made a decision," I said into the crushing silence. "About Leo." A tiny, pathetic flicker of hope sparked in his eyes. "I'm going to do it," I said. "I'm going to donate my kidney." The hope in his eyes flared, desperate and bright. "And then I extinguished it forever. But not for you. You need to understand this. This has nothing to do with you or fixing us. There is no us. I am doing this because there is a child who is innocent in all of this. He does not deserve to die because of his father's cowardice." He just stared at me, the hope dying, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I found the number for my lawyer and press call, putting it on speaker for him to hear. Catherine Shaw's office. "Hi, Catherine, it's Alara Collins." "Alara, is it time?" "Yes," I said, my eyes locked on my husband's broken face. "I'm sure. Please have the papers drawn up and ready to be filed. The surgery is scheduled for Tuesday morning. I want him served." At the hospital, I hung up. The silence that followed was absolute. He understood. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a procedure already in motion. All that was left was to schedule the surgery and prepare for the day I would sever myself from him, in every way a person can. Tuesday morning arrived. Cold and gray, the sky the color of surgical steel. The hospital's pre-op wing was a world of hushed efficiency. The air smelled sharp and sterile, a clean scent that couldn't quite cover the underlying notes of anxiety. I sat on the edge of the gurney in a thin, paper-like gown, the fabric cool against my skin. Nurses bustled around me, their voices soft and practiced as they checked my vitals, inserted an IV, and asked me the same questions over and over. "Any allergies, hun? Feeling any pain or discomfort? Can you confirm your name and date of birth for me one more time?" Through it all, I felt a strange and profound calm. The fear of the surgery, of the pain, of the recovery, it was all secondary. A distant hum beneath the clear, sharp note of my purpose. I wasn't a patient. I was a soldier on the day of a critical mission. My war wasn't against my own body. It was against the man waiting just on the other side of the double doors. A final nurse came in to tell me they were ready. As she started to wheel my gurney toward the doors, I asked her to stop for just one moment. I looked down the long, polished hallway. Standing near the water fountain, pretending to read a magazine, was a man in an ill-fitting suit. He met my eyes, and I gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. He closed his magazine, tucked it under his arm, and began walking toward the surgical waiting room. He was the process server my lawyer had hired. The final piece of my plan was in motion. The nurse pushed my gurney through the doors. The last thing I saw before they swung shut was the back of the server's rumpled suit as he pushed open the waiting room door. I didn't have to see what happened next. I could picture it perfectly. Mark would be in there, playing the role of the tormented but hopeful father. He'd be pacing, accepting sympathetic looks from Nora's family, the architect of this grand, tragic drama. He'd be waiting for news that his son was saved, that he was saved, that his careful balancing act of a life might just survive this catastrophe. And then a stranger would walk up to him. A stranger who would look him in the eye and hand him a thick, legal envelope. I imagined the confusion on Mark's face, turning to dawning horror as the man's voice cut through the quiet, anxious hum of the waiting room, loud and clear and official. "Mark Collins? You've been served," I imagined Nora's head snapping up. The shocked, confused faces of her family. The public, humiliating implosion of his carefully curated worlds. The moment he realized that my act of generosity was not an act of forgiveness, but an act of severance. The price of his son's life was his own. He would get to be a father, but he would no longer get to be a husband. Not to either of us, as my gurney rolled under the bright, circular lights of the operating room and the anesthesiologist's kind face loomed over me, telling me to count backward from 10. A faint, determined smile touched my lips. This wasn't just a surgery. It wasn't just a donation. It was a liberation. As the cold rush of the anesthesia pulled me into the darkness, I wasn't thinking about the past 15 years of lies. I was thinking about the rest of my life. I was not just giving a part of myself to save a child. I was taking the rest of my life back. I woke up slowly, drifting up from a deep, dreamless darkness. The first thing I was aware of was a dull, persistent ache in my side. A fire that burned but didn't consume. The second was the rhythmic, gentle beeping of a machine next to my bed. It was a peaceful sound. A sound of survival. I opened my eyes. The lights in my hospital room were dimmed, casting a soft, hazy glow. Through the window, the sky was a deep, bruised purple of early evening. I had made it. I felt empty. But it wasn't a bad emptiness. It was a clean, quiet emptiness. The space that is left after a raging fire has finally burned itself out. The heavy, suffocating weight of my 15-year marriage, the constant anxiety of living with a lie I didn't even know was there, it was gone. All that was left was the ache in my side and an overwhelming, profound sense of lightness. I was free. The next morning, a nurse helped me sit up in a chair. She told me the surgery had been a complete success. The kidney was a perfect match, and Leo was already showing signs of improvement. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it left me dizzy. He was going to be okay. The innocent one was going to be okay. Later that afternoon, there was a soft knock on my door. It was Nora. She stood in the doorway looking hesitant, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. Her face was still etched with exhaustion, but the raw terror in her eyes was gone, replaced by something softer. She stepped inside. "I hope this is okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The nurses said you were allowed visitors." I nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. She sat down, her posture still so tired. "He's awake," she said, a small, watery smile touching her lips. "The doctors, they're optimistic. They said the kidney started working almost immediately." She looked at me, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't know what to say. Thank you feels so small for what you've done. I'm glad he's okay," I said, and I meant it. We sat in silence for a moment, two women connected by a man's lies and a boy's life. "I left him," she said suddenly, her gaze dropping to her hands in her lap. "Mark, after he was served, everything came out. The sheer scale of the lies, a 15-year marriage, a whole other life. I can't. I can't ever look at him again without seeing the man who was capable of that." She looked back at me, her eyes filled with a sad, shared understanding. "He didn't just betray you, Alara. He betrayed us all." Her words were a final, quiet confirmation of a truth I already knew. Mark's meticulously constructed world had finally, completely imploded. He tried to visit me, of course. A nurse came in later that evening, her expression apologetic. "Your husband is at the nurse's station," she said. "He's asking to see you." "He is not my husband," I said, my voice clear and firm. "And he is not welcome here. Please let security know he is not to be allowed in my room. The nurse just nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes, and left. I felt a surge of strength. For 15 years, I had avoided conflict. But now I was building walls. Strong, clear, unbreachable walls to protect my new, quiet peace. The divorce was swift, brutal. My lawyer, Catherine, was every bit the shark she was advertised to be. Armed with the private investigator's binder, the bank statements, the recordings of his manipulative pleas, Mark had no defense. He didn't even try to fight. His lies had left him with no ground to stand on. His cowardice had been his undoing. The proceedings were a formality, a final, legal severing of a bond that had been a fiction all along. With every paper that was signed, with every asset that was divided, I felt lighter and lighter, until all that was left of my old life was a faint, fading scar. 6 months later, the sun streamed through a window that was entirely mine. It fell across a bright yellow armchair I had picked out myself and landed on a stack of books on my nightstand, books Mark would have called frivolous. The air in my new apartment smelled like lemon and fresh coffee, not old secrets and stale lies. After the divorce, I sold the house. I couldn't stand to be in a place where every corner held the ghost of a memory that was never real. I needed a clean slate, a place with no history. I had found peace. But it wasn't the fragile, conflict-avoidant peace I had spent 15 years trying to maintain. This was something different, something stronger. It was the quiet, solid peace that comes from walking through fire and knowing you survived. One afternoon, I was sorting through my mail when I found a plain white envelope with no return address. My name and new address were written on the front in a careful, childish scrawl. My heart gave a little flutter of something, curiosity, not fear. Inside, there was no letter, just a piece of construction paper, folded in half. I opened it. It was a drawing, done in crayon. A drawing of a superhero. It had a big, swooshing red cape and a determined look on its face. And on the center of the superhero's chest, where a logo should be, was a small, unmistakable kidney bean shape. There were no words. No signature. None were needed. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. I walked to the kitchen and placed the drawing on my refrigerator, held in place by a magnet. A quiet, anonymous thank you from a life that was continuing, in part, because of me. A reminder that from the wreckage of my life, something good had been allowed to grow. Later that evening, after a shower, I stood in front of the full-length mirror on my closet door. The steam from the hot water swirled around me. My eyes went, as they always did, to the scar. It was a pale silver line on my side, a neat 4-inch seam where I had been opened up and put back together. For the first few months, I had hated it. It was an ugly, permanent reminder of Mark's betrayal, a brand that marked me as the fool he had played for 15 years. But now it was different. I reached out and traced the line with my fingertips. The skin was smooth, healed. It wasn't a mark of shame anymore. It wasn't his scar. It was mine. It was the receipt for my freedom. It was the price I had paid to save an innocent life, yes, but also to save my own. It was a symbol of the day I stopped choosing the comfortable lie and chose the painful, terrifying, beautiful truth instead. It was the line that separated my old life from my new one. I traced it gently, not with sadness, but with a sense of profound, quiet ownership. Then I dropped my hand. I turned away from my reflection and walked to the large window that overlooked the city. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink. A new day was ending and a new night was beginning. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that tomorrow, when the sun rose again, it would be rising just for me. For the first time in a very, very long time, I was the sole author of my own story. And I couldn't wait to write the next chapter. So, what do we take away from Alara's story? It's a powerful reminder that the most devastating betrayals aren't always born from a single catastrophic act. More often, they're built slowly, brick by brick, on a foundation of quiet, comfortable lies. Lies we not only hear but sometimes choose not to question. The story shows us that the peace we protect by avoiding conflict is often just a fragile illusion, and the cost of maintaining that illusion can be a decade and a half of our own lives. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? The story hinges on Mark's cowardice, but it's also driven by Alara's initial choice to accept the comfortable quiet over the messy, terrifying truth. It forces us to ask ourselves, How many of the cracks in our own lives do we willingly paper over just to avoid the earthquake that would come from looking too closely at the foundation? But that's just my take on it. What do you think was the real turning point for Alara? Was it the phone call from the hospital? Or the moment she found the second ledger in his office? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.